In the heart of São Paulo, Brazil's largest and most crowded metropolis, there once stood a place that would come to symbolize everything broken inside the country's prison system. A place that, for decades, represented fear, violence, abandonment, and the total collapse of human dignity. Its name was simple, but the stories behind its walls were anything but Carandiru. For many Brazilians, that single word still triggers memories, opinions, and debates that haven't faded with time. And for the rest of the world, the Carandiru Penitentiary stands as a case study of how a prison can turn into a city, how a city can turn into chaos, and how chaos can end in tragedy. In today's video, we're going to explore the full history of the Carandiru prison complex, from its creation to the everyday life inside its overcrowded corridors, to the infamous 1992 massacre that shocked the entire world, and finally, to its eventual destruction. We will follow the story as it unfolded step by step, without glorifying criminals or romanticizing violence. The goal is simple: to inform, to document, and to understand one of the darkest chapters in Brazil's modern history. Let's begin. The origins. A promise of order. The story of Carandiru starts long before it became a symbol of chaos. In the early 20th century, Brazil's prison system was already known for being disorganized and extremely violent. Prisons lacked structure, medical care was almost non-existent, and the state struggled to contain rising crime in major urban centers. In 1920, the government of São Paulo had a new idea: building a modern penitentiary complex, one that could serve as a model for the rest of the country. A place where prisoners could be isolated, controlled, categorized, and rehabilitated through education and work. This place would become the Casa de Detenção de São Paulo, later known simply as Carandiru. Construction began in 1920, during a period when Brazil hoped modernization would also bring order. The building was massive, designed like a fortress with high walls, huge pavilions, and long corridors lined with iron bars. For its time, it was considered advanced, even progressive, with separate wings for different crimes and prisoner profiles. By 1956, the complex was officially inaugurated, and authorities proudly announced that Carandiru was one of the most modern detention centers in Latin America. It had workshops, courtyards, medical areas, and space for thousands of inmates. But this promise of modernization would not last long. The prison system grew faster than the government. Economic inequality increased. Organized crime began to form. And within a few decades, the model prison became a microcosm of everything Brazil couldn't control outside its walls. The transformation from order to overcrowding. As São Paulo's population exploded during the mid-20th century, crime rates inevitably rose. The city was expanding faster than its infrastructure, and the police force responded to the growing chaos with mass arrests. It didn't matter whether someone had committed a violent crime or a minor offense. Almost everyone ended up in Carandiru. The prison, originally designed for about 3,000 inmates, soon held twice that number, then 3 times. Eventually, it became normal for Carandiru to hold more than 8,000 men, making it one of the largest prisons in the entire world. Inside, the situation deteriorated quickly. Cells meant for 4 prisoners held 20. Mattresses covered the floor, sometimes stacked in layers. Showers were limited, food was scarce, and basic hygiene became a luxury. Every day, new inmates arrived, and the prison expanded not through construction, but through improvisation and survival. Because the authorities couldn't control everything, the inmates began establishing their own internal order. Rules, punishments, and hierarchies emerged. Cell bosses controlled entire corridors. Smuggling became routine. Conflicts between factions grew. Weapons were made out of anything people could find: metal scraps, wood, even toothbrushes. By the 1970s and 1980s, Carandiru was no longer a prison. It was a city of the condemned, operating under its own system, with its own leaders, its own illegal economy, its own justice, and its own violence. Officially, the state ran Carandiru, but inside, it was a world apart. Life inside. A reality few could imagine. To understand what Carandiru became, we need to understand what daily life looked like for the average inmate. Unlike what movies sometimes show, the majority of prisoners weren't heavily armed gangsters or dangerous masterminds. Many had been arrested for petty crimes. Some were awaiting trial, unsure of whether they would be convicted at all. Others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. But once inside, everyone was treated the same. Life was a constant negotiation between fear and routine. The pavilions, large concrete structures connected by iron stairways, were always loud, always crowded, and always tense. Hundreds of men shared the same narrow corridors. The smell of sweat, cigarettes, damp clothes, and spoiled food filled the air. Violence was common, not because every prisoner wanted it, but because it was how the system worked. Conflicts started over debts, insults, or territory. Some were resolved quickly, others spiraled into stabbings. The guards rarely entered the pavilions unless absolutely necessary. In many cases, their presence would provoke more violence, not prevent it. So they stayed at the gates, monitoring movements from outside and letting inmates handle their own disputes. Inside this environment, the strongest controlled the weakest. Protection was currency. Favors had a cost. And alliances were essential. Yet, despite the chaos, there was also something surprisingly human. Prisoners formed friendships. They created routines. They found ways to survive. Some spent hours carving wood, others washing clothes, others lifting makeshift weights built from rocks and scrap metal. And in the center of this world, something unexpected appeared. A doctor. Dr. Drauzio Varella, the unexpected witness. In the late 1980s, a Brazilian doctor named Drauzio Varella entered Carandiru as a volunteer. He wasn't a politician, and he wasn't working for the state. His goal was simply to offer medical assistance to inmates during one of the worst HIV epidemics Brazil had ever seen. What he witnessed inside forever changed him, and, eventually, the world. Dr. Varela saw overcrowded cells where diseases spread faster than treatment could reach. He treated men who had never seen a doctor before entering prison. He learned about the unwritten rules that governed life inside, and he earned the trust of people who had no reason to trust anyone. He saw the brutality, but also the humanity, something that most outsiders never imagined existed in Carandiru. Years later, his book, Estação Carandiru, would become a bestseller and expose the reality of the prison to a global audience. His descriptions were calm, factual, and painfully honest. Men sleeping on the floor, makeshift weapons hidden everywhere, tension so thick that a single argument could ignite a riot. But among all the stories he collected, one day would stand above all others. October 2nd, 1992. The day everything exploded. The tension before the storm. By the early 1990s, the situation inside Carandiru had reached an unsustainable point. Overcrowding was worse than ever. Food was limited. Disputes between pavilions grew. And a new generation of younger, more desperate inmates had arrived, bringing even more instability. Outside the prison, São Paulo itself was changing. Violence was high, and police forces were under pressure to show strength. The government wanted control, not negotiation. And inside the pavilions, inmates felt the same frustration, but had far fewer tools to express it. In this tense environment, all it took was one spark. On the morning of October 2nd, 1992, a fight broke out between two inmates in Pavilion 9, one of the most overcrowded and dangerous areas of Carandiru. The conflict escalated quickly, drawing other prisoners into the chaos. Officers tried to intervene, but they were outnumbered, and the situation grew unstable. The guards withdrew. The inmates barricaded themselves inside, and the state decided to respond with force. What happened inside Carandiru on October 2nd, 1992, remains one of the most debated, analyzed, and controversial moments in the history of Brazilian public security. To this day, the massacre raises questions about excessive force, responsibility, human rights, and the limits of state authority. But to understand the decisions that were made, we first need to understand what truly triggered the confrontation. Let's return to that morning. The riot begins. Pavilion 9 ignites. It started the way many prison conflicts begin, with an argument. two inmates from rival groups inside Pavilion 9 got into a fight. Some witnesses later said the dispute was over a personal matter. Others said it was over a bed, a space, or a micro-territory inside the overcrowded building. In a place like Carandiru, where tension was always on the edge, small arguments could quickly become something larger. Within minutes, the fight escalated as friends and allies of both men intervened. Punches were thrown. Then improvised weapons appeared. Sharpened metal pieces, wooden sticks, anything that could be used in a confrontation. The guards attempted to isolate the problem, but Pavilion 9 was already out of control. Some prisoners began running. Others barricaded doors and blocked stairways. The hallways became a maze of desperate movement and raw panic. No one knew exactly what was happening, only that the situation was spiraling into chaos. The guards made a quick decision: retreat. They left the pavilion and locked it from the outside to prevent the conflict from spreading to other wings. But that meant nearly 1,000 prisoners were now trapped inside Pavilion 9, without supervision, without order, and without a way out. Outside, the prison leadership tried to assess the situation. Smoke, shouting, echoes of fighting, and scattered fires signaled that a riot was beginning. In a matter of minutes, the situation had escalated into something authorities believed they could no longer negotiate with. What happened next would forever stain Brazil's history. The arrival of the military police. Escalation to force hours before the massacre began, the prison administration contacted the military police of São Paulo, the state's primary armed force responsible for maintaining public order. The request was clear. They needed help regaining control of Pavilion 9. At first, officers arrived in small groups, evaluating the scene from outside the tall prison walls. They saw smoke. They heard distant screams. Some officers later said they believed inmates were preparing to kill each other. Others insisted they feared the riot would spread across the entire complex. Whatever their interpretation, one thing was clear: tension was rising. By late morning, the commanding officers made a decision. They assembled one of the state's most heavily armed units, the Rota, an elite tactical group known for its aggressive policing style. Heavily armed trucks, armored vehicles, and squads of officers in full gear gathered at the front of the prison. Witnesses say the scene looked more like a military invasion than a police operation. Inside the walls, the prisoners of Pavilion 9 had no idea how large the response outside had become. Negotiation attempts, or the lack of them. To this day, one of the biggest controversies surrounding Carandiru is whether real negotiation attempts were made before the assault. Some officials claimed they tried to communicate with inmates and failed. Others said there was no time for proper negotiation because lives were at risk. Prisoners who survived insisted that no negotiation happened at all, that no one spoke to them, and no attempt was made to resolve the situation peacefully. Dr. Drauzio Varella, who was present in the prison medical area that day, later said that the riot was small and contained. According to him, the riot had already started to lose momentum even before the police stormed the pavilion. But the state's version was different. Authorities argued that inmates inside Pavilion 9 had set fires, taken control of entire floors, and were preparing to kill rival factions. They said the riot presented an immediate threat, requiring immediate action. The truth, as is often the case in tragedies like this, remains disputed. What is not disputed is what happened next. The invasion. The first shots. In the early afternoon, after hours of tension, the commanding officers gave the order. The police would storm Pavilion 9. Officers lined up at the entrance in formation. They wore helmets, shields, protective vests, and carried firearms ranging from pistols to rifles. Tear gas canisters were prepared, shotguns were loaded, and behind them, additional units waited in reserve. When the gates of Pavilion 9 opened, chaos erupted immediately. The police launched tear gas into the hallways, filling the air with smoke so thick that visibility dropped to almost nothing. Inmates, blinded and disoriented, ran in every direction. Some tried to hide in their cells. Others lay flat on the ground, shouting that they would surrender. Many simply froze, unsure of what was happening. Then the shooting began. Witnesses later described a scene of confusion and terror. Police officers advanced through the corridors, firing their weapons. Prisoners were ordered to lie down, hands behind their heads. Some obeyed instantly, Others panicked and ran. In the smoke-filled darkness, officers sometimes fired simply because they believed inmates were resisting. Inside those tight, overcrowded corridors, bullets hit bodies at close range. Most prisoners had no weapons. Many had surrendered. Yet the shooting continued, a scene of horror, minute by minute. As the police advanced, the casualties mounted. Inmates were found lying in hallways, inside cells, on stairways, and in corners where they tried to shield themselves from gunfire. Some survivors recalled seeing officers shooting prisoners who were already wounded. Others recalled seeing bodies stacked in groups. The violence was overwhelming, fast, and absolute. Dr. Varella would later describe the aftermath as an image that would stay with him forever. Prisoners with gunshot wounds crowded the medical area. Many arrived already dead. Others begged for help as the limited medical staff struggled to treat them. One thing was clear: the force used had not been proportional, and the operation was far from over. The aftermath. Inside the pavilion, silence after the gunfire. By the time the shooting stopped, Pavilion 9 was covered in blood. Walls were marked with bullet holes, floors were slippery, bodies were scattered across the building. The final death toll would shake the world. 111 prisoners were killed. Most of them died from gunshot wounds. Not a single police officer died. This statistic alone raised immediate questions that would haunt the operation for decades. How had 111 unarmed prisoners been killed while the heavily armed invasion force suffered no fatalities? Was the force truly necessary? And could the massacre have been avoided? The police claimed that inmates were resisting, attacking, or preparing to kill other prisoners. But multiple autopsies later showed that many victims were shot at extremely close range, some while in positions that indicated surrender. Some prisoners were found with their hands raised, others were shot in the back. Some bodies had multiple bullet wounds at angles suggesting execution-style killings. Whether the police acted in fear, fury, or calculation, the result was clear. What happened inside Pavilion 9 was no longer just a riot. It had become a massacre. Immediate reactions: shock, denial, and damage control. When the news broke, Brazil reacted with a mix of shock and disbelief. The number of deaths, 111, was unprecedented in the history of Brazilian prisons. Journalists demanded answers. Human rights organizations condemned the operation. Families of prisoners gathered outside the prison gates, desperate for information. At first, official responses were vague. Authorities praised the operation as a necessary action that prevented further violence. Some public figures argued that the prisoners had asked for it. Others insisted the police had no choice. But as details emerged, these narratives began to collapse. Reports surfaced describing the conditions inside the pavilion. Survivors told stories of executions, not gunfights. Medical examiners revealed that a large percentage of victims had been shot in the head or chest from close range. International organizations called for investigations. Amnesty International denounced the operation as one of the worst human rights violations in recent Latin American history. And suddenly, the state of São Paulo found itself dealing with a tragedy it could not hide and a scandal it could not ignore. Inside the medical wing, Dr. Varella's testimony. In the middle of this overwhelming chaos stood Dr. Drauzio Varella. As soon as the shooting stopped, officers brought wounded inmates to him and his team. Some were carried, others crawled in with the last of their strength. The doctor later described seeing prisoners arriving with deep bullet wounds, shattered bones, and collapsed lungs. Some begged him, "Please don't let me die." Others were silent, staring blankly into nothing, already beyond saving. He worked for hours, drenched in sweat and blood, trying to treat as many people as possible with extremely limited resources. What he witnessed would later appear in his book. The brutality, the despair, and the overwhelming sense that the tragedy had been unnecessary, that other options had existed. But that truth would take years to be acknowledged. The prisoner's perspective. Voices from inside. Survivors of the massacre later gave detailed testimonies about what happened inside Pavilion 9. Many said the riot had already calmed down by the time the police stormed the building. According to them, the police didn't enter to negotiate. They entered to dominate. They said officers shouted orders but fired before prisoners could react. Some alleged that inmates were forced to line up in hallways and then shot. Others said they saw officers beating wounded prisoners who begged for help. Multiple survivors claimed that some prisoners were executed inside their cells. These testimonies painted a picture of excessive violence and almost complete disregard for human life. The truth of what happened in those moments would be debated in courtrooms, newsrooms, and political chambers for decades. But what could not be debated was the scale of the tragedy. 111 dead, hundreds wounded, a prison forever marked by blood, a country forced to confront itself. The aftermath. Carandiru changes forever. The massacre did not end when the shooting stopped. In the days that followed, fear consumed the entire prison. Guards tightened control. Inmates mourned their friends and tried to understand how such a catastrophe had been allowed to happen. Pavilion 9 became a symbol of violence, neglect, and state power gone unchecked, and the world took notice. International pressure mounted. Journalists demanded access. Investigators requested documents. Human rights organizations published reports detailing the brutality of the operation. The massacre became a turning point in the global discussion about police violence, prison overcrowding, and human rights in Latin America. Yet, despite all the outrage, justice would be slow, painfully slow. Trials would take years, decisions would be reversed, appeals would stretch across decades, and the legacy of that day would continue to haunt Brazil long after the last body was removed from Pavilion 9. The massacre inside Pavilion 9 was over. Bodies had been removed, the smoke had settled, and the prison grounds had returned to an eerie, unnatural quiet. But outside the walls of Carandiru, the real battle was just beginning. A battle for the truth, for justice, and for accountability. Because what happened on October 2nd, 1992, was not something Brazil or the rest of the world was willing to forget. The investigation begins, slow, chaotic, and contested. In the hours after the massacre, the state government of São Paulo attempted to control the narrative. Initial statements described the police operation as necessary, professional, and successful. Authorities insisted that the inmates had been heavily armed and that officers acted only to prevent a larger tragedy. But as the bodies were laid out and the first autopsies began, their story collapsed. Many victims had been killed by close-range shots. Some had bullet wounds in the back. Several had been hit multiple times. And not a single police officer had died. When these details surfaced, reporters, lawyers, and human rights groups demanded a full investigation. However, what followed was anything but straightforward. The first challenge was the crime scene itself. After the operation, the police had quickly cleaned Pavilion 9. Blood was washed off the floors, shell casings were removed, and the positions of bodies were not documented. Key evidence was lost, some permanently. Investigators had to rely on testimonies, autopsy reports, and surviving inmates to reconstruct what had happened. But these testimonies often conflicted with the official reports filed by police officers on duty that day. Even so, one fact remained undisputed. 111 prisoners had been killed, the highest number of inmate deaths in a single police operation in modern Latin American history. The struggle for accountability. Decades in court. For years, the legal process moved slowly. Cases were opened, paused, reopened, and contested repeatedly. Prosecutors accused officers of using excessive force. Defense attorneys claimed the prisoners had started the violence. Politicians intervened. Judges hesitated. It wasn't until 2013, more than 20 years after the massacre, that the largest trial finally began. Dozens of police officers were charged with homicide. The trial drew international attention. Survivors testified, some breaking down as they described the violence they had witnessed. The prosecution argued that the officers had acted with unnecessary brutality, that many prisoners were executed, not killed in combat. They presented autopsy reports, medical records, and survivor statements. The defense insisted that inmates were armed, that the police acted in fear for their lives, and that the state's priority had been to prevent a larger riot. After weeks of testimony, something historic happened. The verdict: guilty 72 officers were convicted. Sentences ranged from 48 to 624 years in prison, depending on the number of deaths attributed to each officer. The verdict was celebrated as a rare victory for human rights in a region where state violence often went unpunished. Families of victims cried outside the courthouse. Survivors spoke of long-awaited justice. But that victory was short-lived. The reversal, when the past reopens old wounds. In 2016, the Court of Appeals overturned the convictions. The judges argued that the officers had acted under legitimate self-defense. They claimed the operation had been chaotic and that it was impossible to determine which officer fired which shot. They also argued that police forces acted to protect the lives of other prisoners who might have died in the riot. This reversal caused outrage. Human rights groups condemned the decision. Families of the victims protested. International observers called the reversal a huge setback for justice in Brazil. To this day, the legal status of the massacre remains complex. Different rulings, appeals, and reversals have left a cloud of uncertainty over the question: who was truly responsible for what happened in Carandiru? No high-ranking politician or commanding officer ever served time. Most police officers charged in the massacre never spent a day in prison. And for many Brazilians, the case represents a painful symbol of impunity. Public opinion divided and loud. One of the reasons the Carandiru case became so controversial was the intense split in public opinion. Some people argued that the police had done what was necessary. They believed the inmates were dangerous criminals who had caused the riot, and that force, no matter how extreme, was justified to stop further bloodshed. Others insisted that even the worst criminals have fundamental rights, and that a massacre committed by the state was unacceptable under any circumstance. These divided views reflected a deeper problem: Brazil's long-standing struggle between public security and human rights. Carandiru became a symbol of that conflict, a mirror reflecting the country's unresolved issues around policing, inequality, and justice. The rise of the PCs. A new power emerges. Although the massacre was a tragedy, it also had unexpected consequences that would change Brazil's criminal landscape forever. Before 1992, many prisons in São Paulo lacked a unified organization among inmates. Alliances existed, but they were unstable and constantly shifting. The massacre changed that. Survivors of Pavilion 9, along with inmates in other prisons, reacted to the brutality by forming stronger internal networks. These networks eventually gave rise to the Primeiro Comando da Capital, or simply the PCC, which would become the largest and most powerful criminal organization in Brazil. Their mission at the time of their creation was simple: to prevent another Carandiru. They believed that only unified inmate power could protect prisoners from state violence. Over time, however, the PCC grew beyond that original purpose, expanding into drug trafficking, arms trading, and international criminal operations. In a tragic and ironic way, the massacre contributed to the rise of a criminal force that would reshape Brazil's criminal world for decades. Closing Carandiru, a symbol falls. The massacre placed Carandiru under an international spotlight. Public opinion shifted. Politicians realized the prison had become a stain on the country's image. For years, activists demanded its closure. Dr. Drauzio Varella repeatedly stated that the building represented everything that was wrong with the system: overcrowding, neglect, and violence. Finally, in 2002, 10 years after the massacre, the São Paulo government began transferring inmates out of the complex. Pavilion after pavilion was emptied. The structures aged, deteriorated, and became ghostly reminders of the tragedy. And then, in 2004, demolition began. Walls were torn down. Corridors that once held thousands of desperate men were reduced to rubble. The ground that had witnessed one of the darkest episodes in Brazilian history was cleared. Where Carandiru once stood, the state built something new: a large urban park called Parque da Juventude, the Youth Park. It includes recreational spaces, sports courts, a library, and cultural centers. Symbolically, the transformation represents a desire to turn a place of suffering into a place of renewal. But even as the prison disappeared physically, its memory remained. Carandiru's legacy. Lessons and failures. Carandiru is more than a prison, more than a massacre, more than a political controversy. It is a case study in what happens when a state loses control of its prison system and then tries to recover that control with overwhelming violence. Several lessons emerge from its history. 1. Overcrowding is not just a number. It is a danger. Carandiru was designed for 3,000 inmates, but held more than 8,000. Overpopulation created tension, violence, and desperation. When basic living conditions collapse, violence becomes inevitable. 2. Neglect breeds chaos. Years of insufficient staffing, poor medical care, and lack of rehabilitation programs contributed to the collapse of order inside the prison. 3. Brutality creates more brutality. The massacre was meant to restore control. Instead, it fueled anger, strengthened criminal networks, and contributed to the rise of the PC. 4. Impunity damages trust. The inability to hold responsible parties accountable created a lasting wound in Brazilian society. For many, the failure to punish those responsible represents a larger problem: the difficulty of confronting state violence. 5. Memory matters. The demolition of Carandiru removed the physical structure, but not the memories, the stories, or the lessons. Books, films, survivor testimonies, and public debates ensure the world remembers what happened. Dr. Varella's final words: humanity inside hell. Over the years, Dr. Drauzio Varella continued to speak about Carandiru, not only as a doctor, but as a witness. His message is simple but powerful. In the moment of death, all people are equal. He reminds the world that prisoners are human beings, not numbers, that even those who commit crimes deserve dignity, and that the measure of a society is not how it treats its best citizens, but how it treats its worst. His book, Estação Carandiru, and the 2003 film adaptation introduced millions to the painful reality inside the prison. He has said many times that he hopes the memory of Carandiru will prevent future tragedies. But whether that hope becomes reality depends on the lessons society chooses to learn. Conclusion: the story that must be told. The story of Carandiru is not easy to hear. It is filled with violence, injustice, neglect, and sorrow. But it is also a story about resilience, memory, and the ongoing struggle to protect human rights. For Brazil, the name Carandiru carries a weight that may never lighten. It represents the failures of a system, the consequences of political neglect, and the danger of letting institutions collapse. For the world, Carandiru is a warning, a reminder of what can happen when power goes unchecked, when prisons become warehouses, and when society stops caring about what happens behind walls. 111 men died in Pavilion 9. Their names were different, their crimes were different, their stories were different. But in death, they became united by history. And that history must never be forgotten. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to Foreign Stories for more detailed documentaries about real events from around the world.